Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are looking at these suggestions passed to the developers once again. There's a bunch of cool ones here when it comes to aviation for September as we continue to catch up with all the stuff that is going on. This week, hopefully ahead, we'll be looking at all of the past developers of the last few months. We're getting there, there's probably 5 or 6 more to go. And I apologize for them being late, but as I said, it's been a very busy period in the game for quite a while. As always though, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and also like it. Let's get into the aviation. The first one is the Focke-Wulf 200C4, which obviously is part of the Condor series, the Focke-Wulf 200s. It was equipped with the BMW Bramo 323 R2 engine, and it was the most refined of the 200s with a maximum speed of excess of 400 kilometers an hour and also a reinforced airframe, heavier offensive payload, an HDL-151 turret, Loft 7 sight, and also a search radar, which is pretty cool. It had MG151s in it on the A&D stands, and then also MG15s and or MG31s in the S stands, and a MG15 in the C stand as well, and of course a 131 in the B stand. Its bomb load carried internally was pretty nice. It had a decent setup. It could carry a ton of different things, up to around about 2,000, 2,800 or even up to 4,000 maybe amounts of bombs. Even 5,400 seems to be the maximum carry weight. What is kind of funny is the article itself though, because halfway down it throws in a conspiracy theory, and I always enjoy those. So it says, in War Thunder, the Focke-Wulf 100C4 should replace the rare, unsuitable, out-of-place 200C1 model, because we can't have both, that's not fair. As the C1 was nothing more than an interim stopgap development model, which has absolutely no business being in this game. I suspect that the C1 was solely put into the game at the expense of the C4, just to keep the C4 from being implemented. Oh boy. So, according to this poster, they've added a vehicle to, for some reason, make sure the other variant of the vehicle doesn't get added. Even though, as we know, there's many vehicles in the game which have many variants of them. I always love a good conspiracy in the morning. The next one is the Kalinin K-7, and in 1930, Kalinin designed the K-7 as a gigantic transport aircraft with a tail carried on 2 booms with 4 1,000 horsepower engines mounted on the wings, but there were no engines at the time with the power, so 6 German BMW 500 horsepower Hornet engines were planned, but they later chose the Soviet engines, so in 1931 it was redesigned, the aircraft to have 7 engines of 830 horsepower. But the early AIM-34 engines were not equipped with gearboxes and had only a power of 750 horsepower. The GUAP, which is the Ministry of Aviation Industry, gave permission for the aircraft to be built, but they wanted the role changed to a heavy bomber. This meant more redesigns in total. There was 4 projects. You had the 1930 and 31 as built and also after modification. There were some vibration problems. That's one way of putting it. This vehicle definitely started to understand what resonance meant. There were some vibration problems, but they were mostly fixed by reinforcing the booms, by adding steel angle girders, and brace the tail with struts. A.M. Snegerev said it was very responsive, was easy to control. You just pull the yoke and the machine responds. Original designs were whole wood with a 5-spar wing, but Kalinin decided to switch the whole metal welded structure with 3-spar wings. It was completely made with Russian steel. It had 12 gunners with 8 20mm cannons and 8 7.62 machine guns. The K-7 had no blind spots. Every direction was under fire by at least 3 gunners. Bombs were located in the wing bomb bays, and bomb bay frames were included into the wing structure, and also, depending on the required range, bomb load varied from 9,900 to 16,000 kilos, with the external fuel tanks allowing 2,400 kilometers flight with 6,000 kilos of bombs. Potentially, it could carry one 8.4-ton tank. The head of the GUAP ordered production of 2 more K-7s, scheduled to roll out in the beginning of 1935 in Voronezh Aviation Factory, but after the crash, the team improved K-7s with stressed skin booms of rectangular sections, but in 1935 they were abandoned. One of them was half completed. The first K-7 was completed in the summer of 1933. Ground running of the engines began on the 29th of June. On Flight 9, on the 21st November at 2 p.m., during speed runs at low altitude, resonance suddenly struck and the right tail boom fractured. The aircraft dived into the ground, 30 to 40 degrees at full speed. The first hit into the ground knocked away the landing gear, then jumped, and with the running engines hit the ground again, fire started and burned, killing the pilot, 13 crew, and a passenger. 5 crew survived, which is why this project never went any further. The Ki-88 is here for the Japanese. It was a project for an interceptor. In August of 1942, the Japanese intelligence got first bits of information regarding the high-altitude B-29, and as they didn't have anything capable of effectively intercepting the so-called superfortress, it was quickly figured that there was a need for a new type of interceptor to be capable of to be launched from the Japanese home islands and then intercept the incoming B-29s. The Ki-88 was the result of this configuration progress and was considered to be a good solution for the problem. Yet after tests were made with a wooden mock-up of the plane, it was decided that the performance was somewhat underwhelming compared to the easier-to-produce Ki-61-2, of which a prototype was already completed, and thus the project was shut down in favor of the Ki-61-2 without any Ki-88s ever taking to the skies or ever actually being built. This thing was supposed to have a Kawasaki HA-140 engine with 1,500 horsepower, one 37mm and two 20mm Ho-5s. We also have another Japanese plane, but this is for the Chinese. This is the Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily. This was designated Army Type 99 twin-engine light bomber. This was developed as a predictive countermeasure in a potential war against the Soviet Union. Sacrificing bomb load and range for speed, it was designed to attack enemy airfields and harass ground formations. It could also be fairly maneuverable at the hands of an experienced pilot. However, the design, and in particular the speed, was soon caught up by the advancement of more modern fighters. To counteract this, improvements were made in the Ki-48-2 by improving engine power, lengthening the fuselage, and increasing the overall bomb load. Introduced to the Chinese theater in 1940, it would continue to serve until the end of the war in limited roles, with almost 2,000 produced throughout its course. In Chinese service, the Ki-48 was operated by both communist and also nationalist forces, with the Kuomintang, or the ROCF, operating them from the 5th Squadron 6th Group after being captured mostly following the Japanese surrender. Like many aircraft captured, their service life was ultimately limited due to the shortage of spare parts, and they would become relegated to training aircraft. One aircraft survives today, though, and is preserved in the Chinese Aviation Museum in Beijing. For Italy, we have a pretty cool torpedo. This is the MOTOBOMBA FFF. It was an Italian pattern-running torpedo used by Italian and also German air forces during the Second World War. The designation FFF was derived from the last name of the 3 men involved with its original design: Lieutenant Colonel Prospero Freri, Captain Designator Filippa, and also Colonel Amedeo Fiori. The FFF was a 500mm diameter electric torpedo, which was dropped on a parachute and was designed to steer concentric spirals of between 500 and 4,000 meters until it found a target. It weighed 350 kilos and contained a 120 kilogram warhead. Its speed was variable from 6 to 10 knots, and it had an endurance of 30 minutes. After that, the torpedo stops its run and becomes a floating mine. After 70 minutes from the impact on the water, the self-destruction exploder enters into action. So overall, you basically have a pretty interesting torpedo that would move in spirals. The next one, I'm going to read the first paragraph verbatim, just because of the fact that I don't understand how stuff like this gets passed. As I've said many times, proofreading is very important, especially if you're writing in a language that isn't your own. The Amiot 143 was the first French bombardier ordered after the Armée de l'Air was an army on their own and not a part of the French army. The plane was a medium bomber who could be used as reconnaissance and gunship at the same time. The plane was seen as 3-in-1, following the concept of the multi-purpose aircraft of the Italian general Giulio Douhet. The plane was also cheap to build, which was going well with the low budget of the Armée de l'Air. In 1928, the French Air Ministry issued a specification for a 4-seat multi-place de combat. The plane was to be able to fill the role of bomber, reconnaissance, and escort aircraft at once. The competition following the specification gave birth to serial bomber in the early 30s to be evaluated against each other. Amongst of those aircraft was the Amiot 1-4, who at his early prototype wasn't much different of his competitor but was meeting all the requirement. The first plane flew the 12 April 1931 with Hispano Suiza 12 NBR of 740 horsepower and open cockpit for the pilot and the nose and dorsal gunner. A second prototype was built in 1932, but the intended engine wasn't available, so it never flew. Despite of the absence of engine, an order of 40 plane was made and to be powered by Lorraine 12Q Ida and armed with 3 turrets. The nose dorsal and rear gondolas and twin Lewis 77s. As I've said many times, just get people to proofread your stuff. It's not hard to do. For Sweden, you have another Italian plane, the Caproni T-16B. The story of this thing starts in 1939, where the Swedish Air Force had a bit of a problem. Due to the advent of the Second World War, export from the US had been cut off, and they couldn't purchase from either the Allied powers or also the other areas, especially the UK. And they didn't have the industry in Sweden itself to support any meaningful domestic production. So to rectify this, they went to, at the time, the last neutral country left that was close enough to be feasible. They did consider Japan and purchasing planes like the Ki-27, but that presented obvious enough problems. As such, they turned to Italy, and in 1940 they came to an agreement. For nearly 40 million Swedish kroner, they purchased 84 CA-313s, of which 16 would become T-16Bs. This was a part of what was called the emergency purchase, which also gained Sweden the J-11, the J-20, and Italian engines to use on the B-17Cs. While the 16 of the CA-313s were meant to become T-16s, only 14 of them would ever arrive to Sweden, as 2 of them crashed on their flight from Italy. This is where the discrepancy comes from the 84 CA-313s being purchased but only 82 ever serving within the Swedish Air Force. They were meant for the F-17 based out of Blekinge, but none of the planes would ever arrive to the unit, instead landing at the F-7 based out of Satinaz, where they entered the workshop for modifications. This included lengthening the exhaust ducts, revising the fuel ducts, installing fire guards, and installing air intakes, which solved the mechanical and engine issues that they had faced on the way there. But their poor reputation had already been cemented, and with the B-17 series entering service, they were retired. Before they were, one T-16B was used during the summer of 1942 by the Forsvarscentralen and tested with a aerial naval mine. No test was conducted after the first one, as the T-16B, along with the others, were converted to S-16Bs. The torpedo installations were taken out during the transition and would later be used in the B-3D as a transitionary measure while the T-18B was being designed. So this thing could technically still carry bombs, but also carry torpedoes as well. So it's pretty much as simple as that. But at the same time, they could add the other Caproni, the Standard B, as well for Sweden. The Israelis get a CL-13B Mark VI. The story of it is pretty cool. In the early 1950s, it became clear that the Israeli Air Force required new fighters to counter the MiG-15s that Egypt had purchased from Czechoslovakia. While they had purchased jet fighters from France, such as the Ouragan and Mr. Fauré, Israeli Air Command believed that based off of recent American experiences in the Korean War, the Sabre was the best opponent to face the MiG. In addition, it was felt that Israel needed a second partner to procure arms in the event of an embargo or wartime difficulties. Israel had placed an order for 24 F-86Fs during the 1954-55 period, with Canadair after a deal with North American fell through due to the US pressure, though this deal would also fail due to the country's foreign policy decisions at this time. Canadair made a second concession to Israel in July 1956, this time offering 24 of the new Sabre Mark VI aircraft with American approval. Israel accepted the offer, in dire need of capable jet aircraft, and a contract was quickly negotiated. In September of 1956, 3 Israeli pilots were sent to Cartierville to begin the flight training with the 117 Squadron stationed at Ramat David, planned to receive the Sabre, replacing the World War II era Meteors. The Canadians went as far as to paint 2 or more Sabres in the IAF camo with the Star of David roundel for the Israelis. Things were going as planned until the Suez Crisis commenced in October, and the pilots were forced to return home for combat duties. The US revoked its support for the sale, seeking to mediate peace, with Egypt and Canada obliged at the international arms embargo against Israel. The aircraft that had already been built were confiscated at Cartierville for the RCAF, and the deal was scrapped. Canada sought long afterwards to propose a similar order of Sabre Mark Vs for Israel, though this got nowhere. And the CL-13B Mark VI, while controversial in its Israeli form, is a valuable aircraft when it comes to the game. And to finish off, we have an Australian plane known as the CAC Woomera. Its origin can be traced back to early 1939. The Australian government ordered large numbers of Bristol Beaufort's light bombers from the UK, with the aircraft being assembled and its components manufactured in various local workshops. In doing so, however, the government bypassed contact from the local aircraft company, the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, in order to save the production costs. Upset by the government's lack of investment, the CAC under Sir Lawrence Wackett began work on its own design of a new light bomber. CAC intended the aircraft to outperform the Beaufort in every way, from offensive and defensive armaments to mobility and combat flexibility. Also, the new plane was planned to be used as a dive bomber and also a torpedo bomber. CAC submitted the initial design to the Australian government in early 1940, but no interest was shown. This changed in the latter of that year, as the British cut its critical manufacturing component supply to Australia to focus on maximising its domestic production during the Battle of Britain. With the Japanese threat looming large in the Pacific and the invasion deemed possible, the Australian government changed their stance and ordered 7 aircraft from CAC, which included the Woomera. This vehicle is a very interesting one, at least in my opinion, a good old twin-engined vehicle run by the Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines with 1200 horsepower each. Its armament, it had 2 20mm Spano Mark IIs and 2 7.92 Browning machine guns in the nose. Defensive-wise, it had 4 7.92mm Browning machine guns in 2 remotely controlled twin turrets on the in-engine nacelles, and also 1 Vickers K machine gun on a manually controlled ventral position, which is quite fun. And then also, bomb-wise, it could carry 4 500s or 2 450mm torpedoes, suspended under the fuselage. So overall, just a really cool plane, this one. Its design is so interesting as well when it comes to the center of it. But I would love to see this plane in the game. But as always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank Forge, Siegebreak, Carrion Crow, Nicholas Richardson, Elove Goat, Pyman, Winter Scientist, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie, B. Young, and also Sem Arslan, Wilkski, Uncle Bean, Derek R., Bareen, Lafouche, and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.